One case,
two interpretations,
and one question.
beyond a reasonable doubt. Welcome to Two of a Crime.
Hi, I'm Megan.
And I'm Arabella.
And I always find myself asking questions like, what does that evidence mean? Or how strong is the forensic testimony? And that's what leads me and Arabella to basically have these conversations. So we thought, why are we just having these conversations between us? We'll share them with everybody else. And we find ourselves debating evidence, behavior, media coverage, jury decisions, and sometimes that conversation lasts longer than the documentary itself. When we realized we couldn't be the only ones asking these questions. So, like, not just what happened, but how people decided what happened. Not just the evidence, but what the evidence meant. And sometimes those are two very different things. So each episode, we'll use a case to explore what we call the forensic interpretation gap, the space where evidence, behavior, public opinion, and legal outcomes don't always align.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about the Caylee Anthony case. And it's a really big one because the media, I think, convicted her before she even was charged. So why are we still talking about this case, right? So this happened back, the final charges and acquittal was in July of 2011. So I think this not guilty verdict caused a lot of national outrage. So I think it's one of those that of our generation, it's a really big case because everybody felt it personally. It's kind of like 9/11 for my generation. It's that one crime that I think all of us can kind of put ourselves in the shoes of the people involved. And so it really caused a lot of controversy. So who was Caylee? She was 2 years old. She was living in Orlando with her mom and her grandparents. So I think this whole case kind of circulates around Caylee the daughter, and then grandparents George and Cindy Anthony. First, I think we need to talk about the timeline before we get into anything else. So Caylee's born in 2005. The last known sighting of Caylee was June 15th of 2008. And this is when Caylee's last seen by her grandmother, Cindy Anthony. Cindy later reports that at that point, Casey and Caylee left the home. And then there's this period of 31 days between when Cindy had last seen Caylee. Basically, Casey goes on living her life, even though we find out later, like, her daughter's already missing. So Casey didn't report Caylee missing during this time. There's actually 31 days between when Caylee went missing and when she reported Caylee is missing. And in fact, like, the 911 call on July 15th was made by Cindy. So even at that point, Casey still wasn't reporting her missing. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest controversies you're going to hear in this case. So I think that's where public perception in this case begins. And you're kind of seeing, like, public opinion being formed very early on, again, based on just like the behaviors we see. And that's something that I think you and I really get into and what we want to focus on and what we're going to eventually call, like, the forensic interpretation gap. So the 911 call on July 15th of 2008, Caylee's finally reported missing. She's been missing for weeks. Casey's not providing clear answers. In fact, we're going to see that she lies over and over again, which becomes one of the charges that she ultimately ends up with. This is the first official part where law enforcement becomes involved. So on July 16th, this is when Casey's actually arrested. And so she's initially arrested for child neglect and providing false information to law enforcement. So the investigation begins in August of 2008. Law enforcement searches multiple locations. Casey continues to provide shifting explanations as to where Caylee's whereabouts are. And the public scrutiny really begins to intensify at this point. December of 2008, so we're like 5-6 months later now, this is when Caylee's remains were found. And unfortunately, at this point, the remains are skeletal, right? They've been out in the elements for 6 months, and they've basically become just skeletal. They were found in a wooded area near the home. And this is where the case goes from missing child to homicide. So in this time, Casey goes from being charged with basically child neglect and all of this stuff, and it is up to first-degree murder. And then she would serve time until her trial began in 2011. You're going to see this, but the key pieces here are that there's circumstantial evidence. There's a lot of forensic testimony that happens related to, like, DNA, decomposition, etc. And there are competing interpretations of timeline and behavior. Get in here, sis. So on July 5th of 2011, we get this not guilty verdict ultimately. And she is found guilty of providing false information, but the not guilty verdict, I think, is what was so controversial at the time and even still today. So this verdict surprised millions of people. And at first glance, I think the case seems straightforward, but ultimately we need to discuss why she ultimately was acquitted of first-degree murder. Okay, so the forensic interpretation gap is what we kind of have coined the phrase of what we look at. So what happens when behavior, evidence, and interpretation don't perfectly align? All right, so let's look at behavior first. So Caylee wasn't again reported for 31 days. And so I think what you kind of look at, the interpretation becomes, oh, she must be guilty then. This is kind of where I think the interpretation got ahead of the evidence. So we've got this public opinion that's forming, even though we don't even have any real evidence yet. So I think the first main question that we kind of have to ask is, does behavior equal guilt? So you've got delayed reporting, lying to investigators, the partying and socializing that kept going for 31 days. But this leads to like our part about forensic interpretation and the gap between what's happening or what's shown and what the truth is or what the evidence really says. So the interpretation of this is like only a guilty person would act that way. But truly, human behavior is not a forensic science, and we've talked about that. So people grieve differently. People lie for many reasons. People can behave suspiciously, and it still legally does not mean they're guilty of murder. So can someone look guilty without evidence proving guilt? And I think that's what we're going to see in this case. So the public assumption then is that Casey's behavior answered that question before the evidence ever did. What we kind of talk about is that the prosecutor is responsible for this burden of proof. So they have to prove that they're guilty. And that's where reasonable doubt comes in. So even if you've got all of this evidence, if you have any reasonable doubt, if these jurors end up with any reasonable doubt at all still, they're not going to convict them of these charges. So what evidence then was given, and how does it impact the burden of proof or reasonable doubt? So you've got the state's theory. So before we look at the evidence, we need to understand like what prosecutors were trying to prove. And the state's theory essentially was that Caylee was like her death was not accidental, that Caylee Anthony intentionally killed her daughter and concealed the crime. And the evidence that we're going to discuss was presented to support that theory. The prosecution is arguing that these pieces formed a complete picture of intentional murder. And that's where I think we're going to see this forensic gap. You have any questions?
So I know that they had a heart sticker found on the tape, but thinking about it, you would have to peel the sticker off to put it on the tape because like some stickers aren't easy to tear off. So you would have to like purposely take that off and probably stick it on. So I could see it being like someone might have framed her, but it still doesn't make sense on why it was there.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and I think that's the important part. I think that's how you end up with like these pieces of information that always confuse us, that when we're looking at the evidence, we're kind of like, yeah, either someone intentionally like, mama, they framed you, or like, really, whether they prove it or not, ultimately you're guilty because that piece of evidence says it, right? I think that's a really great point. You ready? That's lay down. You ready? You blocked my face, but that's okay. You ready? So the first piece of evidence we're going to talk about is the evidence that was found in the trunk of this car. So there was odor consistent with decomposition. There were air samples that were analyzed and hair evidence that was recovered. So again, we kind of have this, what we're calling the forensic interpretation gap, which is that there was a body in the trunk, right? Like that's the interpretation. But odor evidence is not proof of a body being in the trunk, and hair evidence isn't proof of like where death occurred. So experts were actually saying it's consistent with decomposition, not that it indicated or that it was proof of, if that makes sense. So I think at this time too, like experts disagreed because the science was so limited at the time. So you kind of saw that the jury wasn't sure. Again, you've got that reasonable doubt just because if the experts are disagreeing, then there's no like definitive, this is exactly it.
But can a hair sample decompose if you're not?
Right. I don't think so. And I think that's like I think that's the major thing, right? Like it has this band of decomposition on it, which means
She had to have been.
it had to have been
Yeah.
someone who was dying, like decomposing, like in the trunk. So I think we all, and I think at the end of the day, you know, I don't think the jury was saying she didn't do it. I think that there just wasn't enough evidence for them to convict her of first degree murder. And so I think that's where this outcry from the public kind of came from, because I think all of us kind of probably feel like she is guilty, you know, and I think that's where it becomes hard because the evidence isn't definitive. It's not always like black or white. Then it kind of leads us to what's the cause of death, right? So prosecution had to argue homicide, even though there wasn't a specific cause of death. So in this case, whenever they did the autopsy, experts couldn't determine how she died. So this question again kind of comes from, how are they going to convict her of first degree murder if they don't even know definitively how she died? So when they did the autopsy, they came back and they said, medical examiner said it was homicide, but they couldn't say, oh, strangulation. Oh, one thing we hear is like chloroform, or drowning. I think was another thing that was kind of brought up, that maybe she drowned in the family pool. But because the remains were skeletal whenever they were found, they couldn't determine it. So basically, again, this is what we're calling our forensic interpretation gap. So the evidence, the cause of death was unknown. The interpretation is she definitely was murdered in a specific way. And so again, we go back to this question of, can we convict someone of first degree murder when the mechanism of death or manner of death is unknown?
How do you kill someone with chloroform?
Well, I think the theory that was kind of provided was that she was chloroforming her to sleep at night. I think like some parents do stuff like this, like give them a little bit of Benadryl, like they'll sleep better at night. This was kind of like obviously a few steps further, like if I give her some chloroform, you know, like
she'll sleep a little bit longer.
And so like the idea was maybe she overdosed on chloroform. She was given too much, she just never woke up. But again, we don't have, like maybe if her remains had been found in August, like we may have had like a true definitive manner of death, but we just don't.
But the tape wouldn't have added up.
Right. And again, I think we've got that kind of later on. We'll talk about it, but even the tape doesn't definitively say this was the cause or this is what caused the death.
I feel like tape would have been there to stop screaming.
Yeah, so, well, I almost think it could have been also like there to kind of throw people off. Like when the body was found, like maybe she was already dead and she put the tape on her.
Yeah.
Or whomever, like the killer, whoever killed her.
It was too far gone to see fingerprints.
Yeah, so I think that's the case. I think that the evidence had just been out in the weather for so long. There was no way for them to be able to definitively again say these are the fingerprints or these are the DNA. The only, like even the hair, I think like in the trunk that they found, they were only able to come back and definitively say it had to have been one of the Anthony women. So either Caylee, Casey, or Cindy. It wasn't short in whatever color Cindy's was. It wasn't like Casey's, I think, was super short at the time. So it wasn't short and colored like Casey's. It was long. And so that's, I think, kind of where the interpretation based on DNA could only go as far to say is it must have been Caylee's based on this. And so I think that's like part of like the confusion in the case too. Again, you're just like crossing all your wires, right? Like you don't have any definitive, it's not like there's video of how she died. It's not like there's any definitive witnesses. You know, there's nothing like that really gives you a clear cut answer to any of it. It's a mystery. You know, none of us will really ever know what happened. Again, that's the hard part for me. All right. So you kind of brought this up already, but the duct tape question. So prosecution, they presented this duct tape that was found with the body. You kind of said it has this heart-shaped sticker. I think we found inside of the evidence that they presented was that Casey had some stickers that were just like this in her, like what they found basically inside of the house or whatever, in the evidence. And so it basically insinuated the duct tape must have come from the house. So prosecution said this duct tape's found with the remains. They said it suggests homicide, but again, we're still saying like it suggests. It doesn't prove anything. And so the defense basically argued the placement and the significance could be disputed. So again, you still are not definitively establishing the cause of death. So you still got that line of reasonable doubt.
And that sticker might be just material, but it looks pretty recent, like it's not been in the weather for months.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. It could be like, I think that the side that you're seeing of the duct tape is the sticky side. So whenever it gets really nasty, you know, like it picks stuff up where the sticker is flipped the other way and it's stuck to the duct tape itself. So it kind of stays nice-ish, if that makes sense. But I agree. Like, I think, again, to a normal person who doesn't do forensic investigations, it's just another question that adds to the reasonable doubt.
And I was also thinking, like, if it was on her skin, that part probably wouldn't have as much around it.
Yeah.
Unless it was, you know, there the whole time and it just was laying in the dirt or something.
Yeah, and I think again, like that's one of the many questions that kind of just comes up, you know, you don't have a definitive answer. Okay. So again, we end up here at our forensic interpretation gap. So we say, okay, this is very powerful evidence emotionally, but it's less definitive evidence legally. So emotionally, yeah, it overwhelms us. We see it, we're emotional to it. But if we've got someone's life in our hands and we're saying, like, again, is there reasonable doubt? I think there is still. Okay. So even some of the strongest evidence in this case, the trunk odor, the hair evidence, the duct tape, all of this, it requires interpretation. So the jurors weren't deciding whether the evidence was suspicious, because I think we all know it was. They were deciding whether it proved murder was beyond a reasonable doubt. So this may be the most important gap in the entire case this week. Many people left the trial believing that a jury had decided Caylee Anthony was innocent, and that's not what happened. Essentially, the jury's job wasn't to determine whether something tragic happened to Caylee, because of course it did. A little girl died. That's tragic every time. So you have all this information, but it's subjected to interpretation. So you have a cause of death that's undetermined, no direct evidence of murder, no eyewitnesses, multiple interpretations are possible. So ultimately, the result here is reasonable doubt still remains. So was murder proven beyond a reasonable doubt? And I think the answer here is no. When evidence requires interpretation, certainty becomes uncertainty. And I think that that's going to become like our motto, or our, you know, whatever, of like our whole series, is that when you have to interpret information that maybe you don't understand and you're having to depend on these experts explaining it to you, sometimes you just are uncertain. The ultimate question, I think, becomes then, why did the jury acquit? Because I think a lot of us really truly believe Caylee was probably guilty in one way or another. So the evidence did exist. You had the lies, the trunk odor, the duct tape, the remains. Like, there was so much that was presented. But there, again, was no determined cause of death. There was no direct evidence. And there were multiple interpretations to this crime ultimately. So the result you end up with is reasonable doubt. And so then the verdict you end up with is not guilty. So that's kind of where it leaves you. You kind of end up in this boomerang effect of like, oh my God, she's guilty. Well, that's what was determined by media and public, but then you end up in court and you're given all this evidence, but it doesn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And so that's where you end up. So the conversation doesn't always end with the verdict.
That's where it starts?
Correct, right. Because sometimes between the evidence and the conclusion, there's a gap. We'll see you next time on Two of a Crime.